Okay, this is going to be a continuation of the previous video, which I haven't actually uploaded yet, so I guess I'll just upload them both at the same-ish time. It's going to be another weapon thing. Previous video, I talked about, just some, simplified, my simplified understanding of, differences between an axe and a sword in real life. And, in real life, like I said, there's, every type of weapon has so many properties to consider, reasons you would use one weapon over another, and even in the same situation, one small detail about what you're doing can completely change your weapon choice. If you have a wide smorgasbord of weapons to choose from in real life before you do a thing, whatever it is, but we're talking kind of ideal scenarios and character creation at the same time. So, yeah. So really, it's just, part of it is, how detailed do you really want to get? For any given system, it kind of depends. There's, for a TTRPG, it comes down to, okay, how much time are you willing to spend on rules arbitration, dice rolls, all that stuff? How quickly do you need a turn to move? And for the most part, something like a system where all the weapons do relatively similar damage, they're all pretty much the same in terms of rough power level and power budget and all that stuff. That makes a lot of sense, to the point where it's as the DM and as the player, you don't have to really think of, oh, well, I'm a double hand axe user in this situation, let me rephrase. You don't want it to think of, or you might not want it to have to consider, okay, this is a X weapon user in Y scenario, as opposed to just, they're a martial. That goes faster. But speed of, and a quicker pace might not be exactly what you're after. If you're after something more crunchy, then yeah, do something more complicated, where every single weapon has all these varying properties. But I think there's always a middle ground. There's always acceptable levels, and you're always kind of compromising in one way or another, no matter what you're doing. It's, you can only design so far, and you have to stop somewhere. So, for an example, in our 40K game, the differences between, quote, regular weapons, chain weapons, power weapons, force weapons, I think there's another variety of weapon that I'm missing. But those are just melee weapons. What's the difference between all those? At the end of the day, at least from a lore perspective, all those weapons they have some different rarities. But in at least in the variation we're playing right now, rarity does not matter, more or less. So it's kind of irrelevant. But that is a factor. A regular weapon is much more accessible than a chain weapon, which is much more accessible than a power weapon, which is much more generally accessible than a force weapon, generally. But does that mean you can't have a guardsman with a power sword? Not really. There's ways you could have that, but it's just the character's power budget. And if you were designing a guardsman with a guardsman-sized power fist, in his, if he has it in his backstory, you got to justify why the fuck he has a power fist in his backstory, and he's not a commissar. But So those like rarities and stuff, they're one differentiating factor, but I'm really kind of looking just at mechanics and like the differences there. But at the end of the day, all these weapons are just designed to, stab a guy. And because in the setting, so many of the factions and individuals and stuff have like hardened armor and personal force fields and all this defensive crap, you need a weapon that can get through all that. And a regular weapon is just a sword or a mace or whatever, and it's going to have limited ability to do that. And we've been adapting some mechanics from the tabletop, which only really the DM fully understands the tabletop, like actual 40K games. So we're just kind of taking his word for a lot of things. But I've got some cursory understandings, and we're lifting a lot of the numbers straight from the tabletop, where, like, in the tabletop, those numbers are way more impactful. Like a +2 in the tabletop is way bigger because you're rolling a d6. And like it's in that 6. Your threshold of success and failure is within that like 6. That's a much smaller range than a d20. But it works, it works more than well enough. It gets the point across. It does feel like some like armor piercing of 2 matters a lot. So, but at the end of the day, all these different weapons, chain weapons, power weapons, force weapons, blah, 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 they're all just trying to get through hardened armor. Like, how would these weapons damage a Space Marine? A regular combat knife or sword or whatever is going to have a lot of trouble getting through hardened ceramite. A chain weapon, it does the job a little better. It's not perfect. It's not going to like rip through ceramite effortlessly, but it's going to have a much easier time. It's going to have a better time than something just like a regular sword, because those teeth are designed to bite through hardened materials. They're not super great at it. It's not like they just glide through ceramite, but they have an easier time. So that doesn't necessarily mean that they should have armor piercing, because one, in the tabletop they don't, but they should do good damage. For example, in the reskin doc that we started off with, chain weapons just do an extra d6, and that's fine. I think maybe we should keep that, but either way, power weapons still do more. But instead, we've got the chain effect, where if you're attacking a non-hardened target, just like a regular dude in normal armor, like basically someone that isn't wearing power armor or hardened armor equivalent, you get additional attacks, which I think is a really cool property. But it does kind of get away from that, you need to bite through hardened targets, and this is literally the opposite. You're more effective against softer targets, which at the end of the day, I think, while hardened targets are a consideration, something like a Space Marine is fighting all sorts of things. And being able to chew through softer targets also makes sense, because that's also a consideration. That's something Space Marines are going to be doing all the time. In the bumpy section of road now, it'll be another 20 seconds. So instead of having all of the weapons focused on hardened armor, I think having chain weapons get this extra feature against softened targets makes a lot of sense. To the point where, like, maybe you would consider switching to a backup chain weapon if you're fighting a bunch of mooks, and you get all sorts of additional attacks, or you're up against a bigger, softer target, something like that. But it's a wrinkle. Whereas power weapons, they get the flame tongue effect of an extra 2d6 damage, and armor piercing, which I think replicates what a power weapon does more than well enough. On the tabletop, that's what they get. They get a +2 AP. But in the lore, theoretically, what they do is allow you to ignore armor. Like a power disruption field allows you to cut through essentially anything, as if any material all had the same durability, more or less. That's what it's written as. And of course, that's not in practice what happens. Sure, you can cut through hardened plasteel and ceramite much easier, but if it's 3 feet thick armor, you're still not gonna cut through it instantaneously. Like, you're gonna be leaving big gouges in it. You gotta carve your way in if you're trying to get into like a tank or something. And even something like a Space Marine, sure, you can cut through their ceramite much easier, but just because you can, that doesn't mean you're gonna get at anything vital instantaneously. Like, it's still relatively thick armor. It's, like however thick it is, armor all over the place, and it's not like you're cutting through it as if that armor isn't there. It's just as if it's like paper mache instead of armor. But that means, like, your aim is affected. Like, if you're aiming at like my head and there's a helmet around it, instead of aiming here, you're aiming here. Like, where, like, your aim is affected by armor, even if you can cut through it effortlessly. With like something like a stab, you're still just stabbing someone center mass. Maybe not, but maybe your aim isn't affected all that much. But I think it's a factor enough to justify like why it's just an AP +2 instead of like ignore armor completely. Also, because ignore armor completely would be absurd, and especially the way most to-hit rolls, even in something like the tabletop, like some of these rolls are essentially arbitrations. Like, exactly what's happening is up to interpretation. Like, are you dodging? Are you relying purely on your armor? It depends on the situation, exactly what the roll is, what you're fighting, who you are. Like, there's a lot of factors you can use, and within like the same kind of rolls, sometimes it's, oh, you block this with your shield, oh, you duck under this shot. Like, there's a lot of different things like that. And then still, force weapons, they don't have an armor piercing value, but they deal psychic damage. What the fuck does that even mean? Like, are you bonking a guy with this weapon? Like, you bonk him with a weapon, and then, okay, you bonk his armor, but he still takes the psychic damage? Like, it gives him a headache? I don't know. Psychic influence, damage, corruption, some strain, something like that. That kind of makes sense to me. But, that's an idea. Like, force weapons are weird. They're the weird ones. They don't have any armor piercing values, and exactly how they deal their damage is a little questionable. But overall, they have this psychic field that, like, damages in a target's mind directly. And so how, like, theoretically, how might I design all these weapon types differently? I don't really know. Maybe just chain weapons would have essentially no armor piercing like they currently do. Maybe they wouldn't have the chain effect. Maybe they would just deal extra damage. That's the simplest way to go about it. Like the biting teeth they deal extra damage when you do get through. Or maybe they just get a minor, like an AP1. And again, I'm not directly taking from the tabletop again. I'm just pure spitballing, designing. I don't even want to use these properties. I like the properties we have. I'm just designing as an experiment. So, like, maybe an AP1 to represent that they're a little better at getting through hardened material. Not as good as a power weapon. And then maybe it overcomes resistance or something. Like, maybe essentially every target could have certain kinds of damage resistance. Like a lot of armored targets just have, they get a tag, like kind of how we're doing a lot of things like, chain parenthesis 1 or something. You could give, instead of giving them a flat like bonus to armor piercing, maybe instead they have something like armor piercing 1, and that goes up against a target's physical damage resistance 1. And if you swing a weapon with so hardened armor will have like a physical damage resistance 1, and if you hit them with a weapon that has a matching or higher armor piercing value, you ignore their resistance, something like that. It's maybe not a whole lot different. Like it's just one other approach to go about it. But this does let you do things like, okay, Space Marines would probably have, I guess, a physical damage resistance of like 2, maybe 3, probably 2. I mean, at least higher than like a chainsaw. But then what happens when an armor resistance 1 meets an armor resistance 2? Does the armor resistance 1 not matter? Or does it just get, like, maybe instead of your damage being halved, it's 3/4, which would be weird math to do. It's not something you really do in something like 5e, but I'm just spitballing. So your damage is reduced, but not as much, compared to like a regular weapon. I don't know. But then something like a power weapon just does normal damage. But those are just like, damage calculation properties. What are some more interesting I tend to think of properties like the chain effect as generally more interesting. I'm just spitballing a bunch of different ideas. I didn't even touch firearms yet. I got some ideas to talk about those, but at the end of the day, a lot of weapon design in systems like this is kind of arbitrary. And it's really, you just arrive on a mechanic that feels good enough and that you like well enough, and that's kind of it. If it works, it works. There you go. There's always, I'm always up for tweaking stuff and revisiting things. I always like doing that. You play a few sessions, I'm not sure if this feels exactly right. That kind of thing. But at the end of the day, it's kind of whatever. Yeah, that's all I got for you today.